I've always been a man of routine. Wake up at 6:30, brew coffee, kiss Sarah goodbye as she heads to her yoga studio, then settle into my home office to debug code for hours. It's a simple life, one I built with her over 8 years of marriage. Our house on Maple Street is modest but ours. White siding, a small porch where we'd sit on summer nights, and a backyard with a grill that's seen more use than I care to admit. Sarah's the lively one, the spark. She'd come home with stories about her students, her laugh filling the rooms like sunlight. I'd listen, nodding, happy to be the steady anchor to her whirlwind. We were good together, or so I thought. Then there's Tom, my best friend since college, the guy who dragged me out of my shell back when I was just a lanky kid with no social skills. He's different now. Still loud, still larger than life, but rougher around the edges. Runs an antiques business, always showing up with some odd piece he'd picked up at an estate sale. A carved wooden box one week, a tarnished silver chalice the next. These have stories, Mark, he'd say, grinning, while Sarah would lean in, her fingers tracing the edges of whatever he'd brought. I didn't mind. Tom's eccentricities were part of him, and Sarah's curiosity seemed harmless. She'd tease him about his treasures, and I'd sip my beer, content to let them chatter. Lately, though, I'd started noticing things. Small things. Sarah's phone buzzing more often, her stepping outside to take calls she'd brush off as studio stuff. The way she'd linger at the door when Tom left after our barbecues, her voice softer than usual. I told myself it was nothing. She was my wife and Tom was my friend, practically family. But there was this one night, maybe 2 months ago, that stuck with me. Tom had brought over a weird little statue, some kind of bird-headed figure, and Sarah had held it longer than usual, her eyes locked on his. "Where do you even find these?" she'd asked, and he'd winked, saying, "Places most people don't dare look." I laughed it off, but something about that moment gnawed at me, a flicker of unease I couldn't place. Our life rolled on, though. Sarah kept teaching her classes, I kept coding, and Tom kept showing up with his oddities. I didn't question it. Why would I? I trusted them both. The house was quiet most days, just the hum of my computer and the distant sound of lawnmowers outside. Sometimes I'd hear Sarah humming in the kitchen, making dinner, her famous lasagna or that spicy chili I loved. We'd eat, talk about our days, and collapse on the couch with some show she'd picked. Normal. Safe. That's what I thought we had. But looking back, I see it now. The cracks forming, so subtle I didn't notice until they'd split wide open. I was blind, comfortable in my little world, while something else was brewing right under my nose. Something I'd never have imagined. Not in a million years. It started with the camera. I'd bought one of those little security things a year ago, mostly because the neighbors had a break-in and I figured it couldn't hurt. Tiny, discreet, stuck it above the living room bookshelf to keep an eye on the front door. Never checked it much, maybe once or twice when we were out of town. But last Tuesday, I was working late, debugging a mess of code that wouldn't cooperate, and Sarah was out. She'd said she was meeting a friend from the studio for coffee. Some girl named Lisa I vaguely remembered. Didn't think twice about it. She'd kissed me on the cheek, grabbed her purse, and left, her ponytail swishing as she went. I stayed hunched over my laptop, the house quiet except for the clack of my keyboard. Around midnight, I stretched, rubbed my eyes, and realized she wasn't back yet. Coffee doesn't take that long, does it? I texted her. Casual, just a hey, you okay? No reply. She's probably driving, I thought, or caught up chatting. Still, my stomach did this weird little flip. I don't know why, but I opened the security app on my phone, pulled up the footage from earlier. I scrolled back to when she left. There she was, 7:42 p.m., slipping out the door in her jacket. Nothing odd. But then I saw something else. At 3:15 that afternoon, while I was on a call with my boss, the camera had caught movement. Tom's truck pulling into the driveway. He'd walked in, didn't knock, just used the spare key under the mat like he always did. Sarah was home then. I'd heard her moving around upstairs. He stayed for 20 minutes, then left. No big deal, right? He'd dropped by before. But why didn't she mention it? I sat there, staring at the screen, that unease from weeks ago creeping back. I replayed the clip. Tom carried a bag. Canvas, lumpy, like it held something heavy. Sarah came downstairs, barefoot, hair loose. They talked, too quiet for the mic to pick up, then disappeared into the guest room. The camera didn't cover that angle. 20 minutes later, they came out. She was laughing, he was smirking. He left, and she went back upstairs. That was it. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe he'd brought her one of his weird antiques to show off. She liked that stuff, but my mind wouldn't let it go. Why the guest room? Why no mention of it over dinner? I'd asked her how her day was, and she just said, "Oh, the usual." I didn't sleep much that night, kept checking my phone, waiting for her to text back. She rolled in at 1:30 a.m., smelling faintly of incense. Not coffee. "Lisa's into some new aromatherapy thing," she said, yawning, and crawled into bed. I lay there, eyes open, listening to her breathe. The next day, I didn't bring it up. Didn't know how. Instead, I started watching. Noticed her phone stayed face down now, how she tilted away when she typed. How Tom's visits got more frequent. Always when I was on calls or out grabbing groceries. I told myself I was paranoid, that I was reading too much into it. But that footage played in my head, over and over, like a loop I couldn't stop. Something was off and I couldn't unsee it. By Friday, I was a mess. Couldn't focus on work. My code riddled with errors I'd normally catch. Sarah acted normal, too normal, maybe. Made breakfast, hummed while she washed dishes, kissed me before heading to the studio. But her phone buzzed twice during breakfast, and she didn't check it. Just smiled and kept talking about some new yoga pose. I nodded, my mind elsewhere. That afternoon, I gave in. Pulled up the camera app again. Scrolled through the week's footage. Hours of nothing, me working, Sarah coming and going, the mailman. Then Thursday hit me like a punch. 2:47 p.m. Tom again. This time he stayed longer, almost an hour. Sarah let him in and they went straight to the guest room. The camera caught a glimpse of that bag again. Bigger this time. I froze the frame. Something poked out. A glint of metal, maybe a handle. What were they doing? I couldn't wait anymore. That night, after Sarah said she was running errands, I went to the guest room, pushed the door open, heart pounding. It looked normal, bed made, curtains drawn. But the air smelled strange, like old wood and something sharp, metallic. I checked the closet, the dresser. Nothing. Then I moved the nightstand, and there it was, a loose floorboard. Lifted it, and my breath caught. A box, carved with symbols I didn't recognize, sat nestled in the space. Inside, a dagger, ornate, rusted at the edges, and a stack of papers. Handwritten notes, sketches of that bird-headed statue Tom had brought, and photos, Polaroids of Sarah and Tom, dressed in robes, holding the dagger, the statue, candles flickering around them. Their faces were serious, almost reverent. My hands shook. This wasn't just an affair. This was something else. Something twisted, something I didn't understand yet. But I would, and they'd pay. I don't know how long I sat there, crouched on the guest room floor, the box open in front of me. My hands trembled as I flipped through those Polaroids again. Sarah in a dark robe, her hair loose, her eyes intense, holding that dagger like it meant something. Tom beside her, his grin gone, replaced by this eerie focus. The sketches were worse. Pages of notes in Sarah's handwriting, detailing rituals and bindings. Words I didn't understand but felt wrong, heavy. The bird-headed statue stared back from the drawings, its beak sharp, its eyes hollow. What had they been doing in my house? My stomach churned, bile rising, but I couldn't look away. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a violation, a secret world they'd built behind my back. I shoved everything back into the box, slid it under the floorboard, and stood, my legs shaky. The house felt different now. Too quiet, too still, like it was holding its breath. Sarah wouldn't be home for hours, if her errands were anything like her coffee with Lisa. I paced, my mind racing. Tom's truck, the bag, the guest room visits, it all clicked. They weren't just sneaking around. They were using our home, my trust, for whatever this was. I grabbed my laptop, pulled up the security app, and dug deeper. Days of footage, fast-forwarded. Tom showing up when I was out, Sarah letting him in, always that bag. Always the guest room. One clip from last week showed them leaving. Sarah's face flushed, Tom carrying something wrapped in cloth. My hands clenched. I needed more. The internet became my next stop. I searched the bird-headed statue, typed antique bird figure ritual into the browser, scrolling through forums and obscure sites. Took an hour, but I found it. A match on some collector's page. Horus idol, Egyptian revival, late 19th century. Used in fringe occult circles for symbolic ceremonies. Ceremonies. The word lodged in my chest. I cross-checked the dagger, similar hits tied to the same weird groups. Nothing concrete, just whispers of private gatherings. Artifacts with power. I laughed, a hollow sound. Power? They were playing dress-up with old junk in my house. But the photos didn't look like play. They looked real. Too real. I kept digging. Found a post on a shady antiques thread. Someone asking about Tom's business. Saying he'd sold them a charged relic. Charged. That's what Sarah's notes mentioned. Charging the bond. My head spun. Were they lovers? Or something else? Partners in some diluted game? I didn't care anymore. The why didn't matter. The what did. They crossed a line, mocked me, used me. I closed the laptop, my jaw tight. The clock read 9:17 p.m. Sarah's car pulled into the driveway minutes later. I heard her humming as she walked in, keys jingling. "Hey, hon," she called, casual as ever. I stayed silent, sitting in the dark living room. The box's contents burned into my brain. She didn't notice me at first, just kicked off her shoes. When she saw me, she paused. "You okay?" she asked, tilting her head. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Just tired," I said. She bought it, kissed my forehead, and went upstairs. I didn't sleep that night. I planned. The next few days I played my part. Smiled at breakfast, asked about her classes, nodded when she rambled about her day. Inside, I was a furnace. Rage simmering, waiting. I didn't confront her, didn't tip my hand. Not yet. I needed to know everything, needed to be sure. Tom came over Saturday, like clockwork, grinning as he hauled in a wooden crate. "Got something special this time," he said, setting it on the coffee table. Sarah's eyes lit up, and I watched her, saw the way her fingers twitched toward it. "What is it?" I asked, keeping my voice even. He pried it open. A brass bowl, etched with loops and swirls. "Old Persian maybe," he said. "Perfect condition." Sarah leaned closer, brushing his arm. "Accidental, sure, right?" I let them talk. Let them think I was the same old Mark, quiet, oblivious. While they fawned over the bowl, I slipped upstairs, grabbed my old voice recorder from the office. Tiny thing, barely used. I hid it in the guest room, tucked behind a lamp, set to run for hours. Then I waited. Sunday, Sarah said she was meeting a client mid-afternoon. I pretended to nap on the couch, heard her leave, then checked the driveway. Empty. I pulled up the camera. Tom's truck rolled in 10 minutes later. They didn't waste time. Straight to the guest room, bag in tow. I stayed put, heart pounding, letting it play out. An hour later, they left separately, of course. Smart. I retrieved the recorder that night, after Sarah was asleep. Plugged in my earbuds, hit play. At first, just footsteps, muffled voices. Then Sarah, "Did you bring it?" Tom, "Yeah." Fresh from the guy in Philly. Untouched. A rustle, something heavy set down. "We need to be quick," she said. "He's been quiet lately." Him. Me. My grip tightened. Then came the chants, low, rhythmic, not English. Metal clinked, liquid sloshed. Sarah laughed, sharp and strange. "It's stronger this time," she said. Tom grunted agreement. More chants, then silence. I ripped the earbuds out, my pulse roaring. Stronger. They were doing it again, right here, mocking me with every word. I didn't know what it was, didn't care. It was enough. Monday I called in sick. Drove to a hardware store 2 towns over, bought rope, duct tape, a cheap burner phone. Stopped at an electronics shop, picked up a small tracker, nothing fancy, just enough to ping a location. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it all, not yet. But my mind was clear, sharp. I thought about the Polaroids, the dagger, their smug faces. They thought they were untouchable, hidden in their little game. I'd show them. I'd strip it all away, leave them raw and exposed. Sarah taught yoga, balance, harmony. Tom hunted relics, history, value. I'd give them a lesson in consequences, one they'd never forget. By Tuesday, I had a plan. Not fully formed, but close. I just needed one more piece, one more push to set it in motion. Wednesday morning, Sarah left early. Some sunrise class, she said. I waited till her car was gone, then went to work. First, the tracker. Slipped it into the lining of her purse while she showered the night before. Checked the app, her studio, right where she should be. Good. Next, Tom. I texted him from the burner. Kept it vague. Found something you'll want. Meet me at the warehouse on 12th, 8 p.m. He'd know the spot, an old storage place he used for overflow inventory. No reply, but I knew he'd bite. Curiosity was his weakness. Then I prepped the guest room. Moved the bed aside, pried up the floorboard, left the box out. Dagger, photos, notes, all of it. A baited hook. I spent the day refining it. Drove to the warehouse mid-afternoon. Scouted it. Empty, dusty. A tangle of crates and shadows. Perfect. Set up a folding chair. A single bulb hanging from an extension cord. Brought the rope, tape, a crowbar just in case. Back home, I cooked dinner, spaghetti, her favorite. Sarah came in at 6, tired but chatty. Good class? I asked. She nodded, twirling pasta. Exhausting, but yeah. Her purse sat by the door, tracker still pinging. I smiled, asked about her night. Early bedtime, she said. I nodded. Got a late call myself. I lied. Client thing. She didn't blink. 7:30. I left. Kissed her cheek, said I'd be back late. Drove to the warehouse, parked a block away. Tom's truck was already there, lights off. I walked in, saw him by the crates, pacing. Mark, he called, squinting. I flicked on the bulb, stepped into the light. Hey man, I said casual. What's this about? He asked, hands in his pockets. I gestured to the chair. Sit. I'll show you. He hesitated, then sat. I moved fast. Rope around his wrists, tape over his mouth before he could shout. His eyes widened, panicked, but I just stared back. You'll see, I said. Step 1 was done. Sarah was next. Tom struggled against the ropes, his muffled grunts echoing in the warehouse's hollow space. I stood over him, the crowbar loose in my hand, not threatening, just there. His eyes darted, searching for an explanation, but I didn't give him one. Not yet. I pulled out my phone, checked the tracker app. Sarah's purse was still at home, probably on the couch where she'd left it. She'd be asleep by now or close to it, thinking I was out on some late-night errand. Good. I had time. I crouched in front of Tom, close enough to see the sweat beading on his forehead. You're wondering why? I said, my voice low, steady. You'll get it soon. I reached into my bag, pulled out one of the Polaroids. The one where he and Sarah held that dagger, their faces lit by candlelight. I held it up, let him see it. His eyes widened, then narrowed, a flicker of recognition turning to dread. Yeah, I said. I found it. All of it. I tossed the photo onto his lap, stood, and paced a slow circle around the chair. The guest room, the box, the notes. Your little visits. Thought I wouldn't notice, huh? He shook his head, muffled sounds pushing against the tape. Denial, maybe, didn't matter. I wasn't here for excuses. I'd brought a few things from home. Small touches to make this hit harder. The brass bowl he'd shown off last weekend, now scratched and dented from my earlier test run. I set it on a crate in front of him, let it catch the bulb's dim light. Recognize this? I asked. His gaze flicked to it, then back to me. You brought it into my house. You and her playing your games. I leaned in, my face inches from his. My house, Tom. He flinched and I straightened, satisfied. Step 1 wasn't about hurting him, not physically, not yet. It was about stripping away the smugness, the control he thought he had. I grabbed my burner phone, texted Sarah from it. Emergency at the warehouse on 12th. Come quick. No name, no context. She'd assume it was Tom, her partner in whatever this was. I pocketed the phone, turned back to him. She's on her way, I said. You two can explain it together. His breathing quickened, chest heaving against the ropes. I didn't smile, didn't feel like it. This wasn't joy, it was necessity. I dragged another chair over, set it 10 feet from his, and waited. The warehouse was silent except for his stifled protests and the distant hum of traffic. My hands flexed around the crowbar, itching to move, but I held still. Patience was key. Headlights flashed through the cracked windows 20 minutes later. Her car. I stepped into the shadows, watched her pull up, climb out. She looked confused, hesitant, clutching her purse, the one with the tracker I'd planted. She pushed the door open, stepped inside, and froze when she saw Tom tied up, the bowl glinting in the light. Tom! She whispered. Then louder, what's going on? I stayed hidden, let her take it in. She rushed toward him, hands reaching for the tape, but I moved then, fast, silent. Slammed the door shut behind her, locked it. She spun, eyes wide, and saw me. Mark! Her voice cracked. I didn't answer, just pointed at the second chair. Sit, I said. She didn't move, so I stepped closer, crowbar tapping my leg. She sat. Sarah's face went pale, her hands gripping the chair's arms like it could anchor her. Tom's muffled protests grew frantic, but I ignored him, my focus on her. She stared at me, mouth opening and closing, searching for words. I didn't give her the chance. I walked to the crate, picked up the brass bowl, and dropped it at her feet with a clang. You know what this is, I said. You know what you've been doing. Her eyes flicked to Tom, then back to me, a silent plea. I wasn't buying it. I pulled the stack of Polaroids from my bag, fanned them out, and threw them onto the floor between them. Pictures scattered, her with the dagger, him with the statue, their robes, their rituals. Mark, she started, but I cut her off. Don't. My voice was sharp, colder than I'd ever heard it. I saw it all. The guest room, the floorboard, the recorder. Every word. I pulled the little device from my pocket, hit play. Her voice filled the space. It's stronger this time. Followed by Tom's grunt. The chance. Her face crumpled, hands flying to her mouth. Tom's head dropped, defeated. I stopped the recording, tossed it onto the pile of photos. You used my home, I said. My trust. For this. I gestured at the mess. The bowl, the pictures, them. She shook her head, tears welling. It's not what you think. It's... What? I snapped. A hobby? A game? I stepped closer, looming over her. You brought him in, hid it from me, laughed about it. I turned to Tom, ripped the tape off his mouth. He gasped, coughing. Tell her, I said. Tell her what you told me. He didn't speak, just stared at the floor. I grabbed his chin, forced his eyes up. Tell her. He swallowed, voice hoarse. It was real, he muttered. The artifacts, the rituals, they're real. Sarah's breath hitched, but I didn't care about their nonsense. Real or not, it didn't change what they'd done. I dragged the crate over, dumped the rest of my haul onto it. Sarah's notes, the dagger, the bird-headed statue. You wanted power? I said. Connection? Whatever this was. I picked up the statue, held it high, then smashed it against the concrete. Cracked, pieces skittering. Sarah cried out, Tom flinched. It's nothing now, I said. I grabbed the dagger next, snapped its brittle blade under my boot. Their faces, shock, loss, fed something dark in me. Not enough, though. I needed more. I turned to Sarah. You're going to watch him break first, I told her. Then it's your turn. I tied her wrists to the chair, quick and tight, ignoring her pleas. Tom tried to speak. Mark, listen, we didn't mean. But I taped his mouth again, harder this time. I stepped back, surveyed them. My wife and my best friend, bound, exposed, their secret shattered at their feet. The warehouse felt alive now, humming with what was coming. I pulled a water bottle from my bag, splashed it over Tom's head. He sputtered behind the tape. "Stay awake," I said. "You don't get to drift off." Sarah sobbed, begging me to stop, but her voice was noise, white noise I tuned out. This was just the start. They'd feel every second of what I'd planned. I let the silence stretch, heavy and thick, until Sarah's sobs quieted to whimpers. Tom's eyes followed me, wary, water dripping from his hair onto his shirt. I didn't rush. Rushing was sloppy, and this had to be precise. I'd spent years coding, debugging, refining, making chaos into order. This was no different. They'd built their little world, their betrayal, piece by piece. I tear it down the same way. I walked to my bag, pulled out a small speaker, set it on the crate, plugged it into my phone, scrolled to the recorder file and hit loop. Their voices, Sarah's laugh, Tom's grunts, the chants, filled the warehouse, bouncing off the walls. Over and over. Sarah shook her head, pleading. "Mark, please turn it off." I didn't. I let it play, let it sink in. "You liked it enough to do it," I said. "Now you get to hear it." Tom squirmed, ropes creaking, but he wasn't going anywhere. I dragged the crate closer, piled the broken statue pieces on it, the snapped dagger, the soaked Polaroids. Their relics, their bond, ruined. I grabbed a hammer from my bag. Not big, just enough, and held it up. "You thought these meant something," I said. "Let's see." I smashed the brass bowl, denting it further, then tossed it at Tom's feet. He flinched, muffled curses leaking through the tape. Next, I turned to Sarah, pulled a chair up, sat across from her, close enough to see the mascara streaking her cheeks. "Why?" I asked, not expecting an answer I'd believe. She stammered. "It was escape, something bigger than us." I laughed, sharp, bitter. "Bigger than us?" I leaned in. "You had me, 8 years, and you picked him." I jerked my head at Tom. "For this." She flinched, but I wasn't done. I stood, grabbed a marker from my bag, and wrote across her notes. Big, black letters, "Lies," dropped them in her lap. "That's what it was," I said. "All of it." Tom's turn again. I ripped the tape off, let him speak. "Mark, I'm sorry," he rasped. You didn't think I'd find out," I finished. "You thought I was weak." I taped him back up, tighter, then splashed more water. Cold, straight from a jug I'd brought. He shivered, eyes furious. "Good. I wanted them uncomfortable, raw." The speaker droned on, their voices a relentless backdrop. I stepped back, watched them. Sarah crying, Tom glaring. My chest tightened, but not with guilt. With purpose. This was balance. They'd taken everything, my peace, my trust. I take theirs. The warehouse felt smaller now, the air thick with the looped recording. Sarah's laugh, Tom's low chants, over and over. It clawed at the silence, a constant reminder of their betrayal. Sarah's head hung low, her wrists red where the ropes bit in, tears dripping onto the scattered Polaroids in her lap. Tom's shirt clung to him, soaked from the water I doused him with, his eyes burning holes into me. I didn't flinch. I'd spent days planning this, nights awake with their voices in my head. This wasn't impulse, it was justice my way. I walked to the crate, picked up the dented brass bowl, and turned it in my hands. "You thought this was worth it," I said, voice steady. "Worth me." I dropped it, let it clatter, then grabbed the jug of water again. Poured it slow this time, right over Sarah's head. She gasped, sputtering, her hair plastered to her face. "Mark, stop," she choked out, shivering. "Please." I didn't. I set the empty jug down, pulled a flashlight from my bag, bright, piercing, and aimed it at her eyes. She squinted, turned her head, but I held it steady. "Look at me," I said. She did, reluctantly, her pupils shrinking in the glare. "You don't get to hide," I told her. "Not anymore." I swung the beam to Tom, caught his glare. "You either." The light danced between them, relentless, stripping away their comfort. I killed the speaker, let the silence crash in. Their breathing filled the space, ragged, uneven. I dragged my chair closer to Tom, sat, and leaned in. "Tell me about the rituals," I said. He shook his head, tape muffling whatever he wanted to say. I ripped it off, rough, careless. He winced, licking his lips. "It was stupid," he rasped. "Just something to feel alive." I stared, waiting. "She wanted it too," he added, glancing at Sarah. Her head snapped up, eyes wide. "Don't," she whispered. I turned to her. "Your turn." She hesitated, then muttered, "It was connection. Something ours. Ours." The word hit like a brick. I stood, grabbed the broken dagger blade, and pressed it to the crate's edge, twisting until it cracked more. "Yours?" I echoed, tossing the pieces at their feet. I wasn't done. From my bag, I pulled a stack of photos, not theirs, mine. Pictures from our life, Sarah and me at the beach, Tom and me fishing, barbecues on Maple Street. I held them up, one by one, then tore them slow, deliberate, letting the pieces fall. "This was mine," I said. "You took it." Sarah sobbed louder, shaking her head, but I kept going until the floor was littered with shredded memories. Tom's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Good. I wanted them to feel it, the weight of what they'd destroyed, piling up around them. I stepped back, surveyed the scene. The flashlight beam cut through the dust, their faces pale and drawn. It was working. They were cracking. I grabbed a roll of duct tape, reinforced their bindings. "Tighter now, no give." "You're staying here," I said, "until I decide what's next." Sarah's voice broke through, desperate. "Mark, we can fix this. Please." I laughed, a sound that startled even me. "Fix it." I crouched in front of her, eye level. "You don't fix a lie this big." I stood, turned off the flashlight, plunging us into near darkness. The bulb overhead flickered, weak. "Sit with it," I said. "Both of you." I walked to the door, locked it behind me, and left them there bound, surrounded by their wreckage. My car waited a block away. I drove home, mind buzzing, already plotting the next move. Back at the house, I couldn't sit still. The living room felt foreign, her yoga mat in the corner, the couch where we'd watched movies, the kitchen where she'd hummed making dinner. All tainted now. I poured a glass of whiskey, neat, and stood by the window, staring at the empty driveway. The tracker app showed her purse still here. She hadn't grabbed it before rushing to the warehouse. Sloppy, like them. I downed the drink, the burn steadying me, and went upstairs. Our bedroom smelled like her, lavender lotion, faint incense from her coffee nights. I tore the sheets off the bed, tossed them in a heap. Couldn't stand it. I sat on the bare mattress, opened my laptop, and pulled up the security footage again. Rewatched every clip. Tom's truck, Sarah's glances, their guest room exits. Each frame fueled me, sharpened the edges of my plan. They thought I'd break, that I'd yell and walk away. They didn't know me. I'd spent years fixing messes, code, projects, deadlines. This was just another mess, bigger, uglier, but fixable. My way. I grabbed a notebook, started sketching timelines, steps, outcomes. The warehouse was phase 1. Exposure, humiliation. Phase 2 would be worse. They'd lose more than their pride. I thought about their words. Tom's feel alive. Sarah's connection. Excuses thin as paper. I'd given her everything: stability, love, a home. Tom had my trust, my friendship, and they turned it into this robes, daggers, some twisted fantasy. I laughed again, bitter, and poured another drink. The clock read 2:14 a.m. They'd been in the warehouse 4 hours now. Cold, cramped, scared. Good. I imagined Sarah's tears, Tom's defiance crumbling. It wasn't enough yet, but it was a start. I needed them to feel trapped, helpless, like I'd felt watching that footage, finding that box. Downstairs, I rummaged through the garage, tools, old junk, things I could use. Found a box of zip ties, a tarp, a propane torch I'd bought for a project and never touched. My mind clicked, ideas forming, dark and precise. I didn't want blood, didn't need it. This was about breaking them down, piece by piece, until they had nothing left. I loaded it all into my car, drove back to the warehouse. The night was quiet, streets empty. I parked, walked in, and flicked on the bulb. They were still there, heads bowed, shivering. Sarah's eyes met mine, pleading silently. Tom's were glassy, exhausted. I didn't speak, just set the tarp down, started arranging my tools. Let them wonder. I unfolded the tarp, spread it out between their chairs. A blue, crinkled sheet that rustled in the stillness. Sarah's breath hitched, Tom's head jerked up. I didn't look at them, just kept working. Zip ties on the crate, torch beside it, methodical. "Mark," Sarah whispered, voice raw. "What are you doing?" I ignored her, pulled a chair over, sat facing them. The bulb buzzed overhead, casting jagged shadows. I picked up the torch, flicked it on. A small, blue flame hissing to life. Their eyes locked on it, wide, terrified. I held it steady, let it burn for a moment, then clicked it off. "Relax," I said. "I'm not burning anything. Yet." I stood, circled them, slow. "You built something," I said. "A secret. Took my life. Twisted it into yours." I stopped behind Tom, rested a hand on his shoulder, light, almost friendly. He tensed. "You brought her in," I said. "Showed her your toys, your stories." I moved to Sarah, crouched beside her. "And you ran with it. Made it yours." She shook her head, lips trembling. "It wasn't like that." I straightened, grabbed the zip ties, snapped one tight around Tom's ankles, then hers. "It was exactly like that," I said. "I heard you. Saw you." I dragged the crate closer, piled their broken relics on the tarp, statue shards, dagger bits, the bowl. "This is what's left," I said. Picked up the torch again, lit it and held it over the pile. The flame licked the air, close enough to warm the metal. Sarah cried out, "No, please." Tom thrashed, chair scraping. I shut it off, tossed it aside. "Not yet," I said. "You don't lose it that easy." I wanted them to see it, feel it, their world teetering, ready to vanish. I grabbed the recorder, played it again. Louder this time. Their voices booming, Sarah's chants, Tom's grunts. I let it loop, sat back, watched them squirm. Hours passed. Dawn crept through the windows, gray and cold. They were breaking. Sarah's sobs sporadic, Tom's defiance gone, just slumped silence. I cut the recorder, stood. "This isn't over," I said. "You'll sit with it longer." I packed my bag, left the tarp and relics there, a shrine to their ruin. Locked the door, drove home. Phase 2 was set. They'd beg before I was done. I didn't go straight back to the warehouse. Needed time to refine the last steps, make sure every detail stuck. I drove home as the sun rose, the sky a dull gray that matched my mood. The house was a shell now, empty without her, but I didn't miss her. Not anymore. I showered, changed, brewed coffee strong enough to jolt me awake. Sat at the kitchen table with my notebook, flipping through pages of crossed-out ideas and circled plans. Phase 2 wasn't just about them sitting there, stewing. It was about taking everything, their pride, their bond, their world, and grinding it to dust. I'd already started, but the endgame needed weight. I grabbed my laptop, dug into Tom's business. His antique site was simple listings, contact form, a few glowing reviews. I'd seen his truck loaded with crates, knew he had buyers. Time to undo that. I created a dummy email, drafted messages to his top clients, names I'd glimpsed on invoices in the guest room box. Warning: Tom Delaney's selling fakes. Overpriced junk, no provenance. Check your purchases. Attached blurry shots of the broken statue, the dented bowl. Sent it to a dozen addresses, then posted similar warnings on collector forums using throwaway accounts. By noon, his phone, still in his pocket at the warehouse, would be buzzing with angry calls he couldn't answer. His reputation, his livelihood, gone. Sarah was next. Her yoga studio had a website, class schedules, testimonials, her smiling face on the About page. I hacked it. Nothing fancy. Just a weak password I'd guessed months ago when she'd asked me to fix a login issue. Changed the schedule to nonsense. Classes at 3 a.m., canceled sessions, then rewrote her bio. Sarah Thompson. Unreliable, unprofessional. Beware. Uploaded a grainy still from the security footage, her letting Tom in, timestamped. Locked her out with a new password. Emailed her students from her account. Studios closed. I'm done. Her phone, left in her purse at home, would stay silent. Her clients would scatter, her passion wrecked. I drove back to the warehouse at dusk, hands steady on the wheel. Walked in, found them as I'd left them. Sarah slumped, Tom rigid, both exhausted. The tarp gleamed with their shattered relics, the air sour with sweat and fear. I flicked on the bulb, dragged my chair close. Had time to think? I asked. Sarah's head lifted, eyes red. Mark, let us go, she croaked. We're sorry. Tom nodded, slow, defeated. I leaned back, crossed my arms. Sorry doesn't cut it. I pulled out my phone, showed them the screenshots of the forum posts, the hack studio page. Your lives are falling apart out there, I said. While you're in here. Their reactions were instant. Sarah's gasp, Tom's low groan. I let it sink in, then stood, paced. Tom, your buyers are done with you. Sarah, your students think you've lost it. I stopped, faced them. You took my trust. I took your everything. Sarah sobbed, incoherent, while Tom stared at the floor, jaw slack. I grabbed the tarp, shook it, broken pieces clattered louder. This is what's left, I said. Nothing. I dropped it, let the sound echo. They were hollowed out, shells of who they'd been. Almost there. One more push. Night settled over the warehouse, the bulbs flicker, the only light. I'd left them there all day, bound, helpless, their worlds crumbling beyond the walls. Now it was time to finish it. I brought a duffel bag this time, heavier, packed with the final tools. Set it down, unzipped it slow, let them hear the clink of metal. Sarah's eyes widened, Tom's narrowed, fear and defiance warring in their faces. I pulled out a small projector, plugged it into a battery pack, aimed it at the wall. Hit play. Security footage rolled. Every visit, every guest room trip, their laughter, their exits. Grainy, silent, but undeniable. Watch, I said, stepping back. They did, reluctantly, Sarah wincing, Tom twitching with every frame. I let it loop, their betrayal playing out in stark black and white. You thought I'd never see, I said, voice low. Thought I was too dull, too busy. I grabbed a stack of papers from the bag. Copies of their notes, marked up with my own additions. Dates, times, lies circled in red. Tossed them into the air, let them flutter down. I saw it all. The projector hummed, the footage relentless. Sarah's voice broke through, faint. Mark, we didn't mean. I turned sharp. You meant every second. I pulled out the next piece, a portable speaker, louder than the last. Uploaded the recorder file, cranked the volume. Their chants blasted, filling the space, drowning her pleas. Tom thrashed, chair rocking, but the zip ties held. I set the speaker on the crate, let it run. You'll hear it until it's burned in, I said. Then the final touch, photos, not mine this time. Printed from Tom's site, his prized relics, vases, idols, jewelry. I held them up, one by one, then fed them to the propane torch. The flame hissed, paper curling black. Your collection's next, I lied, knowing he'd believe it. His muffled yell confirmed it. Sarah was a wreck, shaking, sobbing, her voice lost in the noise. I cut her ropes, left her ankles tied. Stand, I said. She stumbled up, trembling. I handed her the torch, forced her fingers around it. Burn it, I said, pointing at the tarp pile. She hesitated, tears streaming. I stepped closer, voice hard. Burn it or I do worse. She clicked it on, the flame trembling as she touched it to the relics. Metal warped, shards smoked. Tom roared behind the tape, helpless. I took the torch back, Cut Tom's wrist ties too. Your turn. He glared, but I shoved the marker at him, pointed at the wall. Write it. What you did. He scrawled. Sloppy. We lied. And I made Sarah add, to you. The warehouse stank of burnt metal and despair. The wall bore their confession, shaky and uneven. The tarp smoldered, their relics ash and ruin. The projector looped, the speaker blared. Hours now relentless. Sarah swayed, barely standing. Tom slumped, hands limp in his lap. I cut their ankle ties last, left them free but broken. They didn't move, didn't fight. I'd won. I turned off the projector, the speaker, let silence crash back. Look at you, I said, walking a slow circle. Nothing left. Sarah's head hung. Tom's eyes stared blankly at the floor. I grabbed my bag, pulled out 2 envelopes. Divorce papers for her, a forged eviction notice for him, claiming his shop lease was void. Dropped them at their feet. Legals handled. I lied again, knowing they'd believe it in their haze. You're done. I'd sold the house that morning. Quietly, cash offer, movers already emptying it. My car was packed, a new city waiting. They didn't need to know that. I wanted them to think I'd be there, watching, a shadow they'd never escape. You'll live with this, I said. Every day. I walked to the door, paused. Don't follow me. Don't call. You're ghosts now. Sarah whimpered. Tom didn't react. I stepped out, locked it behind me, not to trap them, just to slow them. They'd leave eventually, find their lives gutted. Her studio gone, his business trashed, their bond ash. I drove off, the warehouse shrinking in my rearview. No guilt, no regret. They'd betrayed me, built something twisted in my home. I'd torn it down, left them with less than nothing. Maple Street was behind me, a new road ahead. I didn't look back.